Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we're learning Masechta Shavuot daf Ches. We are going to begin on Ches and Aleph, about 6 or 7 lines from the top. So we were learning that even though it's true that when it comes to some of the worst of Averos, such as Gil Rayas, Avodah Zarah, and Shvichas Damim, in which we also say that it has the language of tumah, of impurity, we still say that a person's bringing of the sa'ir is not going to be mechaper for that tumah, but rather only for kodesh mikdashav, which is what we said in yesterday's daf. So let's continue. Omer Mar yochel al sholosh tumos halalu yehe sir mechaper. Again, you would think that we should allow that if a person committed these averos of Gil Rayas, Shvichas Damim, and Avodah Zarah, because it says the word Tumah in them, that the Sa'ir should be mechaper for those sins, Talmud Lemer, mitumais v'loy kol tumais. So the fact that it says from Tumah, it's coming to be memayit and exclude other situations where you can't. It will not be mechaper. So therefore, only the Sa'ir is going to be mechaper for Kodesh Mikdasha. Okay, so fine. That's why we have this language of mitumos, v'lokotumos. So mamatzinu shechil kakasuv machlal kol hatumos, batumos mikdash v'kadashav. So just like we find that the pasuk makes a distinction when it comes to all the other tumas with regard to tumas kadosh mikdashav, that a person can bring an oil of a yared, and therefore by doing that, you're going to be potter, which is a kula, that you only need to do is bring an oil of yared. Notice if you're poor, you could even bring a lower level. However, when it comes to other shkagas, you actually have to bring a carbon kavua. Doesn't matter if you're poor, you have to bring the same kind of carbon. So oil of yared is actually a kula. It's a leniency. So avkan batumas mikdash v'kedoshav Devi Yehuda. So too when it comes to the sa'ir, just like when it comes to a person who had Yediyah b'tchil b'soif, they has to bring an oil b'yared. So too when it comes to Sa'ir b'fnim, so under the times where a person has Yediyah b'tchil not b'soif, so then the Sa'ir panimi can be mechaper for that person until again he develops Yediyah, then he can bring his oil b'yared. So again, but what does that mean? So just like the oil b'yared is only for someone who was tameh and he ate kodesh or went into the mikdash, so too when it comes to the sa'ir, it's a mechaper for the same thing. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So my chalek the maisi ba'oil b'yared. So what do we say? We make a distinction when it comes to tumas kodesh mikdashav that you only have to bring an oil b'yared. So aim avodah zarah. So why do we exclude avodah zarah? Because after all, it does say tumah, and you can say my chalek siman avodah zarah lettuce matzara nazir v'chol demaisi seira v'loy kispa. We see that there is a distinction also when it comes to avodah zarah, that which is a form of tumah, as that's what it says. But we see that it's different than other things. That instead of having certain options, you're obligated to bring a seira, a goat, and not a kesef, not a sheep. So says Rashi, v'shar krisos o kisba o seira. Other than avodah zarah, you could choose one or the other, but here it must be a seira. So since we see that there's something different about the avodah zarah, so why don't we say that maybe also the sa'ir could be mechaper, should be a mechaper dafka for avodah zarah? Because once we see that there's a distinction between avodah zarah and other things, so maybe that should show that the pasuk, which is saying mitumais, maybe it should be coming to exclude avodah zarah. So Amar Kahana anan chalikal hakil kamrinan v'hai chalik l'hachmerhu. So it's true, there is a distinction. However, the distinction that we made when it came to the oil of yared, as opposed to other bring a carbon kavua, so oil of yared is what is a kula, because a poor person could even bring a lower level carbon and be mechaper. So over here by avodah zarah, the chilik there is, but it's actually to be strict to say that you must bring this particular type of an animal. So therefore, it's actually not a reason assume that therefore we should think that the sa'ir should be mechaper for the avodah zarah. Says Rashi, Hai mamatzinu shechiluk shehula hakil meboilon lashkuche. We need to find something which is lenient, domia de seir hapanimi, just like the seir hapanimi de kulahu shiyocha mischaper b'karban sibor. That again, that you can be even a yachid individual is mechaper for a carbon sibor, which is a sa'ir bifnim. So that's a kula. Why is it a kula? Because he has to pay for it. He doesn't have to pay for it because it's a carbon sibor, and yet he's mechaper. So therefore, but when it comes to avodah zarah, this is a chumrah, because let's say all you have is a very expensive seir, you have to buy it. Doesn't matter if you want to be mechaper, you need it. You can't switch to a kesef. So therefore, that would not work. So ema yoledes. Why don't we say when it comes to a yoledes, says Rashi, shim over leha yom kippurim. Let's say Yom Kippur passes, and oichelos bekanshim b'loy carbon, and she eats a kanshim without a carbon. So even though she didn't bring her carbon, she doesn't need to. Once Yom Kippur comes. So why don't we say why? Ema yoledes dechilik demaisi oil of yared. Maybe she should be able to bring a carbon oil of yared will be mechaper. So Amrab Hoishil chol chatasam v'lo chol tumasam. So the whole pasuk says davka that you did a sin, but over what we're talking about is yoledes is someone who is tameh. So when it comes to a carbon yoledes, it's not coming for a kapara, but rather it's a form of purification, so she can eat kachim. So therefore, they're not comparable. Al Rav Shimon bar ben Yochai, di Amri Yoledes nami chaytasi. Yoledes, there's an element of sin as well, as is brought down Masechtas Nida. Rashi says she basically swears, I'm never going to be with my husband again. So apparently that was an element of sin by making the shua. So he actually says you can learn it out from the pasuk itself. Therefore Rashi says, you don't need to learn out from this drasha itself, because you can just see it directly from the pasuk directly. Okay, Ema Mitzayra. So why don't we say that the Mitzayra is that which you should be machalik, and then again maybe the Sa'ir can be mechaper for the Mitzayra. So Rav Hayishel chol chatasam v'loy kol tumasam. Again, a Mitzayra is tamei. There's no transgression by someone who's saras. Rav Shimon bar Nachmeni di Omer al Shibban devarim negoyim boyin ma'akim Emar. He says that the reason why a person gets saras is not for no good reason. It's because this person actually did something wrong, right? There was a bunch of sins, like for example, lashon hara. So how can you tell me there's no sin attached to saras? So hasam negiyoi deachaperle. So the negoyim is what's machaper. The carbon l'shtrui b'kahal. And the fact that you bring a carbon is only in order to matter that person to be able to enter into the kahal. So it says Rashi, what exactly is this nega that is machaper? Betsar negoy, nischaper loy ha'avoin. The fact that you're in anguish with this saras, that is what causes your forgiveness. However, the purpose of the carbon is not for you to be forgiven for your sin, even if it is a sin, but rather it's to allow you to go back into the kahal. And therefore, you can't learn out that it's, as the pasuk says, l'chol chatasam. It's not a chet over here. Okay, so the eman nazir tameh. Maybe it's referring to a nazir tameh. The pasuk says v'yom hashmini yavishtei turim. So he has to bring these two birds. The chilik the ma'isi turim v'yoyna. In fact, you have to bring dove, a turtle dove. This is different. So mavayishi l'chol chatasam v'chol v'loy kol tumasam. Again, when it comes to someone who is a nazir tameh, he's tameh. It's not because of a sin; it's because of tuma. However, the famous Rebbe Lezer Kapper Diarmer Nazir Nami Chaytahu Ma'akamemer. He holds through a Kabbalah that certainly, he says that a nazir is a chayta, because that's what the pasuk says actually, because you were distance yourself from wine. So Rashi says should sear atzmim in the yain, it's going tinus. So it's a sin. So several like Rav Shimon Diarmim Kaimahu Mocher, as we said, that he learns that from Shimon that he actually derives it from the pasuk itself. Okay. Let's slow down. Let's look at question 7. So Mamatzinu Shechel Chasav Mechal Kol Tumois. We make a distinction between this and all other Tuma. Havi Ermer Tumas Mikdash V'Kedashim. So we say it's Mikdash Kodesh V'Kedashim, that the din is there's a din Oil V'Yared. So Ema, why don't we Amayu Nema De'asi with Tumas Avodah Zarah. Maybe you can bring a seira for Avodah Zarah. So he said no, because the fact that there's a distinction by Avodah Zarah that you have to bring a seira, that's a chomer, not a kula. So the fact is that this whole notion of a seira, which is a carbon tzibor, which is machaper for a yachid, is a kula, because then, as Rashi said, the yachid doesn't have to pay for the carbon. So therefore, that's a kula. So you can't win out to Avodah Zarah, which is a chomer. How about Mitzayra, the Chalk, the Maisi, B'Oyav Yarin? So when it comes to Mitzayra, first of all, the pasuk says, L'chol Chatasam, V'lo Tumasam, right? So there's no tum over here. So that's one shot. Or even if you want to tell me, according to one interpretation, that maybe there is a sin. However, when it comes to the Mitzayra, as we just said, according to Rabbi Kapper, he would say Mimkoima hu muchra. Okay, let's look at a couple more questions. They're almost identical. TA2. Ulamadi al shiva devarim negoyin bayin. Sras happens. Madua ein loimer the v'chaper al mikdash al chol chatasam desir panimi koyim mitzayra. That maybe a mitzayra can be mechaper on having a sawyer. So he says no. Negoyim is actually mechaperin on the tsar of the tsaras, and the carbon is lashtud b'kachim, is allowing you to consume kachim, and the pasuk says v'chol chatasam v'loi l'chol tumasam. TB 3. Same question as what I wrote. Enochanami had goyim boyim al chet abel hakarbon lishtor to allow ish lekahal, and I wrote also v'echel kachim. That's when it comes to tzras, it's just entering the kahal. V'achshav yachol likro samid l'chol chatasam l'chol tumasam l'chol chatasam l'chol tumasam l'chol chatasam v'loy koil l'chol tumasam. Okay, I wrote that the other way around. Did they give me credit? I don't know. Let's keep going. Okay, so Rav Shimon Yomim Kaimahu Mochor. So Omer Mar Rav Shimon Yomim Kaimahu Mochor. So Harihu Omer. The pasuk says, what did that mean? So this is the source. V'chipral hakodesh metumois. It's a mechaper for a person who did kodesh metumois. So metumaso shel kodesh v'chul. So it's pretty clear, this diak of Rav Shimon, that is pretty clearly telling us that it's directly from the pasuk, that when it comes to someone who was tameh and he was mechaper al hakodesh, which means it was kodesh mikdashov, that he consumed kodesh or he went to the mikdash. It seemed pretty clear from that pasuk, like him. So on this, so much so, the Gemara almost poses the question: Shabbat Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon is saying a good shot. So therefore, why do you need this whole binyan av to tell us this whole thing above? The Mamatzinu, what do you mean? Mamatzinu. The pasuk says clearly that talking about Kodesh Mikdashov is what is matter with both the oil of Yared or in certain circumstances by a seir. So Rabbi Yehuda Melachahu Meboyle Kihechi Di Ovid Lefnai Lefnim Hachi Nevid Behechel. He's saying that the Zrikas Adam is derived from this pasuk of how it's supposed to be done. That just like Rashi says, B'minyana achas omal v'zayin l'mata midam apar, which we say during the avoda on Yom Kippur by the Chazar Sashatz, we say achas l'shtayim, because it's one up and then one down. So it's one up and then one down, then two down, three down, until 7. And that's regarding to the sprinkle of the dam hapar, v'chein medam hasair. We did the exact same thing for the par and the sa'ir. V'asa hai v'chibra al kodesh v'sui heichel shiasa kmokein al paroiches mebechutz. So not only is it done lefnai lefnim, so it's done in the kodesh as well. So it's done in two locations, and therefore again it's done lefnai lefnim, the zrikas adam, and also in the kodesh. So that's what's come to tell you that the achas lamal v'shavul achas lamal v'zayin lamata is duplicated for the par and the sawyer on Yom Kippur. Rav Shimon, so how does he know that you can do the zrikas adam both places? Hahu v'chein yasa nafka. He learns out from this drasha v'chein yasa. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda, why is he learning from that pasuk? No, if you would only learn it all from that pasuk, havimina nesi par v'sar achrini the naivid. You would think maybe you should take a par and a sa'ir, another sa'ir, and do it. In other words, maybe you would think that there's some type of inyan of taking another carbon and doing it that way. Kamash one, it's the same one. Rav Shimon, l'chein yasel oil moed minei mashma. So he says that you can learn out from here, and therefore Rashi says v'yitule the chibra al hakodesh l'drasha. So Ramar. Yochol, you would think that al koil tumos kodesh yesar zemachaper. You would think that a person is able to have a kapara for anything that they do wrong by the sa'ir that was brought. Talmud Loimer mipsheihem l'chol chatasam. So we say from again this drasha, it's from some of the sins will the sa'ir be machaper. My nihu yesh bo yediyah b'tchil of yesh bo yediyah b'soif. So if he knew that he was tamei originally, and then he forgot in the middle, and then he remembered at the end, so then there's a carbon. That's the only time that we bring the oil v'yored. Now the high bar carbon who, so says Rashi, oil v'yored who. This person he needs to bring a carbon because he knew. So why does it say that yochel? You would think al kol tumos shebikodesh sa'ir zemachaper. So we say, so we see that that if there's the idea of b'chil v'soif, so then that's when it works. What are you talking about? You're supposed to bring a carbon oil v'yared. So that's not a sa'ir. A sa'ir is when there is no yediyah on one of the ends. V'hai bar carbon who? So what are you talking about? Lotzricha. This yadale samacha shkias achama. So it's talking about where he knew about it right before sunset, which was Erev Yom Kippur. Says Rashi, Erev Yom HaKippurim v'lo hayashayis l'havi karbanai. So even though it's true he had the idea b'tchil v'soif, and therefore you should be able to bring the oil v'yared, but once Yom Kippur comes, since Yom Kippur came immediately, he wasn't able to bring the carbon, and therefore the sa'ir will be mechaper form. Sakadat chamina ademaisi chesamet beis. In the meanwhile of him bringing nitlile, it should hang. It should be toila from Yisurin. Says Rashi, the Amida Yisurin. Since there was no time to bring it before Yom Kippur, kamash malon. Okay, so Omer Mar menayin sheyesh bo yediyah b'tchila ve'en bo yediyah b'saif. So that's if there's the idea between Saif. How do we know if there was at least the idea at the beginning that the Sa'ir of Yom Kippur, what you'll say is Toila, and again we're gonna hope that eventually you'll know, and then you bring the oil of the Yared. So Menayin, Micah Kashle, what exactly is this question exactly? It says Rashi, Dial She'enu Bas Carbon Machaper, Vizu Enu Bas Carbon. You can't bring a carbon because he has no Yediyah B'Saif. So Haki Kakashli. Since we said a chet is like a pesha, even though one is b'shoigig, one's b'mezid, ma b'shoyim delab b'nei carbon, just like when it comes to someone on b'mezid can't bring a carbon, avchatoyim nami delab b'nei carbon. So too in this situation is also not going to be able to bring a carbon. So ema ma b'shoyim delab b'nei carbon l'oilam, ma avchatoyim delab b'nei carbon l'oilam. Maybe means he can never bring it, which in this umay nihu ein bo yediyah b'tchil v'yesh bo yediyah b'sof. Maybe it's talking about a situation when could you never bring it if you had no yediyah b'tchila. Since you never knew b'tchila, since you're missing that first element, that can never be rectified. Pumfa carrot, if you had Yediyah B'tchila but not B'soif, so you could eventually B'soif you could have Yediyah. But if you didn't have Yediyah B'tchila, now it's too late. So maybe that's what it's coming to tell you. However, it's the other way around. Bar carbon, who since eventually when you do have Yediyah, you can bring an oil of yard. Maybe it won't be Toila. So maybe it won't work. Maybe the only reason why it could work is because you have no other option. However, over here, if you had the Yediyah B'tchil but not B'soif, and eventually you'll have Yediyah, you bring an oil of carbon oil of yared, so then maybe you won't have this. It won't be Toila. Your Yisurin. Ein bo Yediyah B'tchila v'yesh bo Yediyah B'soif. If you don't have Yediyah at the beginning, we already said Sir Hanasa B'chutz v'Yom Kippur Mechaper. We already mentioned another carbon that's Mechaper, the Sa'ir Hanasa B'chutz. So Sakadamina Nipuch Mepuch. Maybe you should switch them around. In other words, who says which one the Sir B'chutz or the Sir Panimi? Who says that which one is for the Tchila? Yediyah, there's Yediyah only beginning but not end, or vice versa. How do we know which one's which? So Amar Kro Chol Chatosum. So it says Chol Chatosum. Mechlal the Bnei Chatos Ninhu. So we learn from here they're Bnei Chatos, which means these are people that are shaykh to be able to bring the carbon. Who is that? That's someone who has Yediyah B'chil but not B'soif. But eventually he'll have Yediyah B'soif and he'll bring a carbon. So V'neschaper Kapar Gemura. Why is it only Toila? Why don't we say that since he had Yom Kippur and the Sa'ir was brought, so why do we say it's Toila until he has Yediyah, and then only afterwards is he able to bring? Does he have to bring a carbon of? Maybe he's mechaper right away. Why Toila? So iksiv mechatosam kidikamer. B'hashne iksiv l'chol chatosam. It says the language l'chol chatosam. So lahanach diosol l'chol chatos. It's referring to these things which could eventually come to a chatos, which means eventually, once you have Yediyah, you can bring. And therefore, it's not going to be mechaper completely, but it will be toila, your yisurim, and then once you have Yediyah b'soif, then it's fine. So lo matoila. So what's the benefit of it not being being a toila? What does that mean? So Rozer Loimer, she mace below avoin. So the great benefit is that if a person dies, he dies without sin. Rabbi misa marekas. It's the misa which basically cleanses him. El Omer Rava lahagil min yisurin. Is to protect him from yisurin. So therefore, at least you have the Yom Kippur, which will hugin from yisurin. So therefore, that will be its benefit. But that's not enough. It's only toila. It's necessary. He still has to bring an oil yard. Question 8. Menayin deser hapanimi enu toila al sheyesh bo yediyah b'tchila u'b'soif ademesi carbon oil yard. So how do we know when it comes to deser hapanimi that it's not referring to having Yediyah b'tchila b'soif? So because it says umipsheihem l'chol chatosam v'darshinon chatoyim dumi de pushoyim she'enum b'nei carbon. Right? They're not shaykh to bring a carbon. V'lo zed davar carbon. So therefore, the point is, if you have Yediyah b'tchila b'soif, so you can bring a carbon. However, we're talking about a situation where a person cannot bring a carbon at this point in time, and therefore it cannot be talking about a case of yesh Yediyah b'tchila b'soif, because then you can bring an olive yard. So it must be that the soyer panimi is on something else, which is something in which the person cannot bring a carbon. Just like B'meza you can't bring a carbon, this guy also can't bring a carbon, even though he's b'shaygeg, and the reason is because he doesn't have Yediyah yet b'soif. Menayim l'ser hapanimi in mechaper al she'in ba Yediyah lo b'tchila v'lo b'sof. How do we know the ser hapanimi is not going to be mechaper in something which has nothing? So d'chsev v'chol chatosim chayav chatois b'mashmu lo yized lo yiroy level l'chlal chatos. It says lo b'tchila v'lo b'sof. It could be even lo b'tchila u'b'sof. However, it is b'sof. The fact that there's nothing b'tchila, there's no Yediyah b'tchila, so you're never shy to bring a carbon. The pasuk is mashma that you can eventually bring a carbon, and therefore, for that reason, it can't be referring to a case where there's no Yediyah b'tchila. Okay. All right. Ein bo yedia b'tchil v'yesh bo yedia b'sayv ser hanasa b'chutz v'yom kippur mechaper v'chulu. Okay. Again, you can never bring an oil v'yared because you're not shayach because you didn't have yedia at the beginning. So michti eskushi iskish adadi. We make a connection, a hekesh, one to the other. So v'nechaper panimi adidei v'adei chitzayin. So it should be that the panimi should be mechaper for it and for the outer ones. Let's say for whatever reason the outer one was never done, right? So maybe it'll still be mechaper for that also. So achas kapar achas mechaper ve'ena mechaper shtei kaparos. So that's what it means when it says achas. Says Rashi, this pasuk says v'chiper Aharon al karbonos al karnoisav achas b'shana, once a year, with a mizbeach apnimi ksiv, regarding to the inner mizbeach shemechaper olav medam apar v'soyer par she'ol kohanim v'soyer l'om. The par is mechaper for the kohanim and the soyer for the nation. V'alcha kroiserhu dilma istrich ki. Okay, fine. So achas b'shana trees dimni ksivi achas b'shana v'darshimi ne v'chiper achas she'enu kan el kapar achas limad she'enu mechaper kapar acheres. So therefore you can't say it works for the inner and the out. So therefore it can only work for one. V'nechaper chitzon adidei let it be mechaper for the outer. V'en v'amai avid panimi nafkiminu l'toma di'ira bin zelazet. Maybe if a person becomes tummy in between. So makrama achas b'shana kapar zu lo tehei el achas b'shana. So Yom Kippur isn't toila since you could bring a carbon for kapara. So therefore, that's what Rashi says over here. Fine, that's what that is. So we're going to stop there. Let's see if we have another question. Sits, Adkan.